My son tried to tell me a monster was living in our house. The problem was, I was in love with the monster. It didn't begin that way, of course. It began with hope. It began in a sterile community center meeting room, the air thick with the scent of cheap coffee and unspoken anxieties. I was there for a support group for parents of children from hard places. A clinical, sanitized term for the kind of childhood that leaves scars on a soul you can't see. My son, Leo, had been with me for a year. 10 years old, with eyes that held the weary wisdom of an old man and a silence that was a fortress. I loved him with a ferocity that ached, but I didn't know how to reach him. And then there was Julian. He wasn't a parent. He was a guest speaker, an author whose book on childhood trauma was sitting on my nightstand. He spoke with a gentle authority that calmed the frantic buzzing in my chest. He used words like attunement and co-regulation, but he made them sound like poetry, like prayer. When he looked at me during the Q&A, his eyes were kind. Not just polite kind. It felt like he saw me, all of me. The exhausted, trying so hard, terrified single mother who felt like she was failing the one person she was meant to save. After the meeting, he found me by the water fountain. "It's Lena, right?" he asked, his voice even softer without the microphone. "I saw the way you were listening. You're living it, not just reading about it." That was the hook. In one sentence, he validated a year of my silent struggle. We talked for an hour. He told me about his work, about his belief that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a new story around it. I told him about Leo, about how he'd flinch if I moved too fast, how he hoarded food in his bedroom, how he never, ever cried. Julian listened, and I, a woman who had felt invisible for so long, started to fall. He came into our lives like the first warm day of spring. He never pushed. He'd bring over a new board game for Leo, sit on the floor and build a complicated Lego castle without asking a single question, and then talk to me for hours after Leo went to bed. He explained Leo's behavior in ways that made me feel less like a failure and more like a student learning a new, complex language. "He's testing you, Lena," Julian would say, his hand gently covering mine on the kitchen table. "Every time he pushes you away, he's asking, 'Are you going to leave too?' Your only job is to stay." I clung to his words like a life raft. He was the expert. He was the one who understood. So when Leo started to change, I listened to Julian, not my son. It started subtly. A month into Julian's near-constant presence, Leo grew quieter. The small progress we'd made, the fleeting moments of a shared joke or a spontaneous touch, vanished. He began watching Julian with a familiar, chilling stillness. The same stillness he'd had the day I first met him at the group home. It was the look of someone assessing a threat. "I don't like his eyes," Leo mumbled one night as I was tucking him in. "What do you mean, sweetie? He has nice eyes." "No," Leo insisted, his small body rigid under the blankets. "They're not nice when you're not looking. They're hungry." I brushed it off. A child's fantasy, a manifestation of his fear of a new man in my life. I told Julian about it, laughing a little to cover my unease. He grew very serious. "This is a classic attachment response, Lena," he said, his brow furrowed with professional concern. "He's afraid I'm going to replace him. He's creating a narrative where I'm the villain so he can justify his fear. We just have to be patient. We have to show him he's safe." It made so much sense. It was textbook. It was exactly what his book said would happen. And because I wanted so desperately to believe in the perfect family we were building, I chose the expert's textbook answer over the terrified whisper of my own child. That was my first betrayal, and it was the one that would cost us the most. The cracks in the facade began to show, but I kept plastering over them with Julian's reassuring words. One afternoon, I came home early and found Leo's bedroom door shut. I could hear Julian's calm, placid voice from inside. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone made the hairs on my arms stand up. It wasn't conversational. It was methodical, probing. I opened the door. Leo was sitting on his bed, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Julian was in the chair opposite him, leaning forward. He looked up, and for a split second I saw it. The thing Leo had talked about. A flash of intense, predatory focus. An unnerving concentration. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual warm smile. "Lena, you're home," he said, standing up. Leo and I were just talking about bravery. Leo wouldn't look at me. Later that night, I found a half-eaten sandwich hidden under his pillow. He hadn't done that in 6 months. The moment that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday. Julian was working at my house, writing in the small sunroom I'd given him as a study. I was putting away laundry when I noticed his leather satchel was open on the floor. A black, hardbound journal had slipped out. It was his field notes, as he called them. I'd always been curious. I told myself I was just tidying up. I picked it up. My thumb brushed the cover. I knew I shouldn't. It was an invasion of his privacy. But Leo's face, pale and strained from that afternoon in his room, flashed in my mind. I opened it. His handwriting was a neat, precise script, but the words were monstrous. It was a logbook, a catalog of my son's pain. Subject, L age 10, history of neglect, suspected physical abuse. Entry 14, introduced topic of his biological mother. Subject became nonverbal. Fidgeting increased. Observable signs of distress. Excellent material for Chapter 3 on abandonment trauma. My breath caught in my throat. I flipped a page. Entry 17, verbally recreated the scenario of being left at the group home. Subject's breathing became shallow. Eyes darted to the door. This is the raw emotional data I've been looking for. The primal wound in action. I felt sick. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the book. It went on for pages. Detailed, clinical observations of Leo's deepest vulnerabilities. And then, in the margins, were notes written in a different colored ink. Plans. Instructions for himself. Next session. Gently suggest Lena is growing tired of his behavior. Provoke anxiety ray, re-abandonment. Observe and record reaction. Idea, accidentally break his favorite Lego model. See if it elicits a grief response he's been suppressing. Document the process. This wasn't a man trying to help. This was a scientist experimenting on a lab rat. And my son was the rat. The love, the support, the healing, it was all a lie. It was research. He was mining my son's trauma for his next bestseller. I closed the journal, a cold, silent rage building inside me. I walked into the sunroom. Julian was typing, a serene smile on his face. He looked up. "Hey, you, is everything okay?" I placed the journal on the desk in front of him. "What is this, Julian?" He looked at the book and then at me. For a moment, a flicker of panic. Then, the mask of the compassionate expert snapped back into place. He sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound. "Lena, I was going to tell you," he said, his voice dripping with feigned regret. "This is my process. It's immersion. To write with authority, I have to get close to the source material. I know it looks clinical, but it's how I build the authentic narrative. I thought you, of all people, would understand the importance of that. He stood and tried to take my hands. Don't you see? This book will help thousands of kids like Leo. Our story, their story, it will give so many parents hope. He was so good, so convincing. His words were a fog designed to confuse and distort. He was turning his violation into a noble act. For one horrifying second, I almost believed him. The part of me that was so desperate for the fairy tale, for the happy ending, wanted to accept his explanation. Then I looked past him, through the window, and saw Leo in the backyard, throwing a ball against the fence. Alone. So utterly alone because the one person who was supposed to protect him had invited the monster into his home. You're not just documenting his pain, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. You're harvesting it. The smile fell from his face. Lena, you're being hysterical. Get out, I whispered. Get out of my house. Now, but the nightmare wasn't over. The real twist wasn't discovering that he was a user. It was discovering the depths of his depravity. He left, but his poison lingered. The next 2 days were a blur. I tried to talk to Leo, to apologize, but the words felt like ash in my mouth. How do you tell your child you failed to protect them from a predator you willingly brought into their life? The trust between us was a fragile, shattered thing. On the 3rd day, I found the proof that Julian wasn't just an observer. He was a creator. Leo and I were supposed to go to the fall festival. He'd been looking forward to it, but he was withdrawn, hiding in his room. I finally coaxed him out, and he confessed, his voice small and broken. It was Julian, he whispered, not looking at me. The day before he left, you were at the store. He told me we were going to play a game called The Quiet Room. He said it was to help me with my fears. My blood ran cold. What game, Leo? He locked me in the laundry room, Leo choked out, and now the tears he had held back for a year finally came. It was dark. He told me he was going to see how long I could be brave for. I started to scream, but he just stood on the other side of the door, telling me to use my coping skills. He had only been in there for 10 minutes before I got home, but for a child whose trauma included being locked in a closet for hours, it was a reenactment of his worst terror. Julian hadn't just observed his wound. He had taken a knife and sliced it open again just to see what would happen, just to get another chapter for his goddamn book. That was it. The last piece of my foolish, broken heart turned to ice. This wasn't just about exposing a fraud. This was about justice. I knew Julian's agent and his editor were coming to his house the following week to celebrate the completion of his manuscript, the one built on my son's soul. I called the agent, a woman I'd met once at a dinner party. I played the part of the distraught, confused girlfriend. I told her I had found some of Julian's research notes and I was worried. I said I thought it was best if we all met at my house so we could talk it through in a neutral space. She agreed. The day they arrived, I was calm. I had spent the weekend with Leo, not talking much, but just being present. We gardened, we baked cookies. I slept on a mattress on his floor. I was slowly, painfully rebuilding what I had allowed to be destroyed. When Julian walked in with his agent and editor, he looked triumphant. He probably thought I'd come to my senses, that this meeting was my way of apologizing. Lena, thank you for hosting us, the agent said, a brisk, professional woman. We just want to clear up this little misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, I said, my voice clear and steady. I gestured for them to sit on the sofa. Leo was upstairs with my neighbor safe. I didn't have a screen or a projector. I just had the truth. I placed his journal on the coffee table. "This is Julian's research," I said. "Please read the last few pages." The agent picked it up, her expression impatient. As she read, her face changed. The professional confidence drained away, replaced by dawning horror. The editor read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. Julian started to speak, to spin his web of therapeutic jargon and feigned concern. "Now, let me provide some context. I don't think you should say another word," I said, my eyes locked on his. Then, I took out my phone and pressed play on an audio file. It was a recording of a call Julian had made to a friend the day after I threw him out. I'd found it in his cloud backups, still synced to my home Wi-Fi. His voice filled the silent room, stripped of all its gentleness, full of arrogant glee. The kid is a goldmine. I got him to have a full-blown panic attack. The material is so raw, so visceral. They're going to be throwing awards at me. The mother is a bit of a mess, but she was easy to handle. The agent dropped the journal on the table, as if it were on fire. The editor was staring at Julian with pure disgust. The monster was finally revealed, stripped of his disguise under the harsh, fluorescent lights of his own ego. He looked small, pathetic. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation. Just the heavy, suffocating silence of his career ending, of his reputation turning to dust. They left without another word to him. He was left alone in my living room, a king dethroned in his own fraudulent kingdom. I stood by the door as he gathered his things, his hands shaking now. He wouldn't look at me. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. "No, Julian," I said, my voice finally, completely my own. "You have no idea what I've done. I've saved my son, and I've saved every other vulnerable child you were planning to feast on. Now get out of our home. Months have passed. We don't talk about the monster anymore. We don't have to. The quiet in our house is the only proof we need that he's gone for good. It's not a silence born of fear anymore. It's a silence of peace, of safety." The other night, Leo came into my room. He didn't have a nightmare. He just crawled into bed with me, his small body fitting against mine like a missing piece I'd finally found. "You heard me," he whispered into the darkness. "What's that, sweetie?" "Even when you weren't listening, you still heard me," he said. "You just needed to get louder than him." I held him tighter, my face buried in his hair, and I cried. Not tears of sorrow or regret, but of gratitude. In the end, it wasn't an expert or a book that taught me how to be a mother. It was my son. He taught me that true love isn't about finding the right answers in a textbook. It's about learning to trust the whisper of the person right next to you. It's about being brave enough to hear the truth, especially when it's your own child telling you that you were wrong. And in the quiet of our home, in the space where the monster used to be, I can finally hear my own voice. And more importantly, every single day, I make sure to hear my son's.